Hi, my name is Melissa Doherty, and I serve as the Science Communication Specialist for the Kentucky Academy of Science, a scientific society with 5,000 members and a mission to catalyze scientific communication and collaboration to improve research, education, and evidence-based public engagement within the Commonwealth of Kentucky. In today's Sharing Your Science conversation, we are joined by KAS's Science Communications intern, Dr. Wilson Gonzalez Espada of Morehead State University, and Dr. Esther Dupont-Versteegden of the University of Kentucky College of Health Sciences Department. She's also the director of the Center for Muscle Biology and a professor of physical therapy. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you
Dr.
for having me.
Dupont, if you could start by sharing a bit about your background, like where you studied and how you reached this point in your career.
Okay, so yeah, I'm originally from the Netherlands, and I got a master's degree there in movement sciences. So I've always been interested in movement and anything that makes your body move. And came to the United States to do a PhD here. Did my PhD in San Antonio at the Health Science Center in San Antonio, University of Texas. Um, Worked on muscular dystrophy and how exercise influenced muscular dystrophy. So that was my very early PhD work. Then went on to do a postdoc in Little Rock and moved up the ranks there to associate professor, and then moved to the University of Kentucky. And my work has always been stayed within muscle and different aspects of muscle, but mostly muscle atrophy and how you recover from muscle atrophy, because the recovery from muscle atrophy is super important for everybody who has ever been on bed rest, has ever had a period of inactivity. And anybody knows that if you've been in a cast, that your muscle atrophies and your muscle gets smaller. And so you want to be able to recover from that, and how that happens and why with aging in particular, that doesn't happen as well. It's really my main interest.
Sounds like really interesting work, and I'm excited to hear more about it. Dr. Gonzalez Espada, can you tell us what drew you to this research specifically for our Sharing Your Science feature?
I found Dr. Dupont's publication, and it talked to me personally. I had family members who were senior citizens, who were bedridden due to a certain condition. And in their case, it was not related to something like a hip fracture or something like that. It was a breathing condition, usually a heart condition. But the fact that they were in bed for several weeks, that allowed them to go from active and normally walking around to not being able to walk around even after they recover. But they end up not being able to walk at all. So I was really curious about that process, how it happens in humans, and particularly how they were trying to figure out that in animals that hibernate, they don't experience muscle atrophy the same way. So that was my interest.
Awesome. So I think you have some questions for Dr. Dupont.
Yes, Dr. Dupont, let's go way, way, way broad. Can you briefly describe what a muscle is, different types, how do we control them before we go into muscle atrophy?
Yeah, so I think everybody has in mind what a muscle is. So muscle actually makes you move. It makes sure that you're able to move. And muscle is mostly what's the most important part of muscle for movement is the protein that's in the muscle. So you need a lot of protein in muscle to make sure that it can contract and therefore lift things or lift you off the ground, to be able to get up from a chair, to be able to walk around. So the muscle has to be able to contract, and that contraction is done by protein. And that's a very important part of muscle, and therefore how we make protein, how protein breaks down, is super important when we look at how muscle recovers after protein disappears from the muscle and has to come back. So that's a very important part of muscle. Muscle is being made to move by the nervous system. So the nervous system controls when your muscle contracts, and that it contracts in a way that you can actually move, and that you can move in a fluid fashion and not like a robot would move. We move a lot more elegantly than a robot, and your nervous system makes sure that that indeed is the case. And so anytime you have problems with your nervous system may make your muscles not move as smoothly and not move as well. So a spinal cord injury, for example, people will recognize that then your muscles don't move anymore because your nervous system cannot interact with your muscles anymore.
Okay. And can you define for the audience what is muscle atrophy? Are they different types? What causes it? And what's going on inside the muscles that
Yeah.
would make them deteriorate?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different terms for muscle atrophy, and people may have heard those terms. So muscle atrophy itself is plain old the loss of muscle mass. So when you lose muscle mass, that is called atrophy. But of course, what is super important too is the strength that you lose. And when you lose muscle mass, you will lose strength. But you can also lose muscle strength without losing muscle mass. And so the combination of those two is really important, that you keep muscle strength as well as muscle mass so that you can move. There are a lot of different things that can make you lose muscle mass. Inactivity is an important one. So you already mentioned the fact that family members have been on bed rest for a long time. That is inactivity. So they're not physically active, they don't move around. That makes your muscles atrophy, makes your muscles get smaller. Diseases do also cause your muscle to get smaller. So cancer, even if you stay physically active, may make your muscle get smaller. The same is true for cardiac disease. If you have a cardiac disease, it may make your muscle smaller, even though you try to move around as much as you can. And of course, any injury to the nerve will make your muscle smaller because then there's no nerve activity and the muscle will not move. So it's a form of inactivity, but it's a little different because you have nervous system involvement. And then one of the ones that I'm really interested in is aging. Aging itself, even if people remain physically active throughout their life, and I think all of us know people who have remained physically active and are still really good, you can tell they're old because they're smaller, their muscles get smaller. And so how that happens and how that on top of inactivity overlays on how your muscle functions is really interesting and is still a very open field for research. We know a lot of things, but we don't know everything about it yet.
So what you're saying is that if you have a young person that has to be in bed for 2 weeks and a senior citizen that has to be in bed for 2 weeks, the senior citizen will probably have a stronger effect just because the muscles are smaller already.
So they actually don't lose as much muscle mass because they have less to lose.
Oh, okay.
But they don't regain it. The biggest problem is that they don't regain muscle size after a period of inactivity. Or some of them do, some of them don't, but not nearly as much as a person who is younger. And so why that is the case is really what I am very interested in.
I was about to ask you. So what makes the muscle act differently when you're younger or older?
Yeah, really good question. Partly, and probably really good for a lot of NIH funding. But so it's partly the nervous system. So the interaction between the nerve and the muscle deteriorates some with age. And that may have to do with a lot of different things, maybe driven by the nervous system. It's also driven by the muscle. So the muscle, as we all know, as we get older, gets stiffer. Right? People who are older they're not as stretchy. They are stiffer. And so the muscle gets stiffer, and that also contributes to the fact that the nervous system doesn't interact as well with the muscle. So that's one reason. There's also the muscle cannot gain as much protein when you're older. And that's a big area of investigation. Why that is the case, we don't know for sure. There's a lot of underlying reasons why we think that may be the case, but we don't know for sure what that is. But the fact that they have a harder time making new protein is a big problem.
According to the research, what are some of those causes for the muscle not being able to regain that protein?
Yeah, so to make protein, you need protein synthesis. So you need to synthesize more protein. You need to make more protein. And there are a lot of intracellular pathways, so pathways that are inside the muscle itself that cause that protein synthesis to increase in response to, for example, exercise or amino acids. I think people who are big in the exercise field know amino acids. They actually probably take them, they buy them and take them to make more muscle. And an aging muscle, the intracellular pathways that cause that increase in synthesis, they do not respond as well to the amino acids that you can take, or to exercise, or to what we have looked at, to massage, for example, which if you push on a muscle, you can get maybe a little bit of protein synthesis. That doesn't happen in aging.
Okay. Now, in your work with in collaboration with the Alaska group, you were looking at squirrels
Yeah,
and how hibernation doesn't affect their muscles. Can you
yes.
describe a little bit about how you end up being part of that
Yeah.
project? And
How much time do you have?
hey, we can record as much as we want, and I guess somebody else is gonna edit.
Yeah. So, of course, this is a super interesting question, right? If we think about an hibernating animal, any hibernating animal will be physically inactive. They're not asleep. So it's very important to understand that hibernation is not the same as sleep, but they are physically inactive. So they're physically inactive for up to 7 months. So black bears and brown bears, maybe 6 months, but these Arctic ground squirrels that we have looked at, they are inactive for 7 months. And I have to emphasize that this is work that I've been doing in collaboration, but that is really driven from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. And the people who are mostly involved with this work are Anya Goropashnaya, Vadim Fedorov, and Kelly Drew. So I've been working with them, and lately also with another person who was a postdoc there, but is now a faculty member, and her name is Sarah Rice. So those are the people who are doing essentially all the work, and I collaborate with them. I've helped them with some of the muscle analyses and things I know about muscle. But so what these animals do, they are physically inactive for a long period of time. When they come out of hibernation in April, they walk around, reproduce, start eating like there's no tomorrow, get really fat, and in September go into hibernation again. Their muscles do not atrophy. So their muscle size throughout, and that's the paper we published, throughout the 7 months of hibernation remain the same. And so the size remains exactly the same. So if we could figure out how these animals do that, that would be so cool. And that's really why I have sought out to collaborate with them and to work with them, because if we can figure out why those animals do that, how those animals do that is what I should say, that would be really cool. Now, one of the issues with the Arctic ground squirrels is that their core body temperature goes down to below freezing. So in their dens, it can go down to -3 centigrade, and that's really low. We would all die. And so Whether that's a good model for humans, I don't think so. We can still figure a lot of things out, right? We can still figure out how they do this. But the black bear and the brown bear may be better models because their body temperature during the entire season does not go below 32 centigrade. And that is something that humans could potentially take. Not that I'm suggesting that we move people down to 30, because there's a lot of problems associated with lower core body temperature. But that is a little bit more like what humans could associate with, because the metabolism doesn't go down as far. And these Arctic ground squirrels, their heartbeat goes down from maybe 130, 140 a minute to maybe 2 or 3 per minute. And that is just amazing how these animals can do that. It's the whole comparative biology about hibernation is incredibly interesting as a biologist, right? They also, the other thing these animals do, why I think we should pay more attention to them, like I said, they eat like there's no tomorrow until September. So they are fat. They're incredibly fat. There's a lot of fat in these animals. They become insulin resistant, which is very common to people who have diabetes. And but they don't necessarily develop diabetes, right? So they become insulin resistant because they want all their glucose to be used to burn their fat. And so during the wintertime, they burn their fat, not their muscle, right? So they lose all that fat because that's what they now use for energy, because they don't eat during that entire time. They don't eat, they don't drink, they don't pee, and they don't poop. They're just hibernating, they're just existing. And then in April, when they have burned that fat, they run around, and they can because their muscles are fine. They can run around again and do whatever they do, and then eat again and go through hibernation. So they're super, super interesting animals. And there are other hibernators that are slightly different and do different things. And we probably all know just the regular squirrel that you see during the wintertime sometimes. And some of them don't even hibernate anymore because it's warming up. And so it's warm enough that they don't hibernate. And it actually is probably not it's not the temperature that induces hibernation, it's a shortage of food. So they anticipate that there's not going to be enough food. And that's why animals usually hibernate, not necessarily temperature.
Okay, so
that's a long story for your.
no. That's a great story. Now, in the paper, it is described how you analyze this squirrel muscle. What was the main finding? Did you figure out how the squirrels do it? I know that you mentioned some genes, but I'm not a biochemistry guy. So
Yeah. So the short answer to that is no, we did not find out how they do this.
spoiler alert, no, we did.
Yes, we're still doing quite a bit of work on these animals.
Okay.
So yes, the main finding was that the cross-sectional area, which is what we measure to measure a muscle. So every muscle, a muscle is made up of a lot of protein, but that protein is in different cells, and those cells can be really long. If you think of a muscle, your leg muscle being, this long.
Wow.
Then one cell is the whole length of that muscle. And so there's a lot of protein in there, but there's a lot of cells in the muscle. And what we do is we measure the individual cells and how big they are. And those individual cells did not decrease in size, but they also didn't change identity. So every cell has a different identity, whether they're fast contracting, slow contracting, whether they use mostly glucose, whether they use mostly fat, all of these things did not change. And that is very different from what we see during bed rest, for example, or during exercise. With bed rest in particular, those cells change depending on what their activity level is. That is not the case in these hibernating animals, at least not in the squirrels. And so that was the main finding, that the identity of the cells, what we call muscle fiber type, did not change, and the muscle cross-sectional area, which is really the size of the muscle fiber, did not change. That was the main finding. Yes, we looked at a couple of molecules that are involved mainly in the breakdown or the degradation of the muscle. And one of them was somewhat elevated in the beginning of hibernation, but then was lower again towards the end of hibernation. So we think that these animals probably undergo some kind of adaptive state early on, that they maybe increase their protein breakdown, but then something kicks in to alleviate that,
To slow that down.
to slow that and counterbalance that, so that now they can maybe even make more muscle. And so Vadim Fedorov, together with Anya Goropashnaya, they have published some papers earlier where they look at a lot of genes that are expressed during this time period. And they indeed found that a lot of genes that are involved in the making of protein actually are still active during that time period. They're still expressed, is what I should say, during that time period. And genes that are involved in all the molecules that are involved with the making of protein synthesis, are higher. And so that's really interesting, that the muscle seems to be able to compensate for that increase in potential degradation early on. So those were some of the findings that we had. But some of this is still hypothesis, right? I'm talking about what may be and what might be, and that's still hypothesis. So we're still investigating that.
Do you think that we may be able to find either some sort of pre-hospitalization therapy or maybe a medication that will slow that muscle atrophy process if somebody's in bed, let's say 50 years from now? Not
Yeah,
tomorrow.
I'm hoping it's sooner because I'm getting older.
Yeah, we are all, we are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're all getting older. It's better than the opposite, right? So, so yes, I'm very hopeful that by looking at a lot of different animal models and human models of muscle atrophy, that we can figure out what is underlying that inability of people, particularly elderly, to not grow their muscle, and then figure out if we can have a molecule that counterbalances that. One of the molecules I've been really interested in, I've published on for a while and have not been able to get funded, but is an RNA binding protein. So RNA is to get protein, you need RNA. So most people know DNA, but DNA needs to go to RNA, and then RNA becomes protein. That RNA needs to be very well regulated in muscle, and in every cell, but in the muscle. And so the regulation of that seems to be very important. And there's one molecule that is highly elevated during hibernation that we think is involved in that process. And if we could overexpress that, we could potentially make more muscle. So that's one thing that we are working on. And I can go into a little bit more detail why this is very difficult.
Yes. I was about to ask that.
Why it's very difficult for muscle to get bigger through medication is because anything that makes muscle bigger that we have found, so not anything, but a lot of things that make muscle bigger will also induce cancer because it will make cancers grow.
Oh.
Right? So you can imagine that if you make one cell grow, you can make another cell grow too. So that's been a problem in trying to make muscle grow, is that a lot of pathways that lead to muscle growth lead to cancer.
So we need to kind of customize so that it only...
Correct. Yeah. So if we could find something that is either only expressed in muscle, that no other tissue has, or that we can direct towards muscle and doesn't go to any other cell type. That would, and so there's a lot of people working in those directions. And there's a lot of research ongoing in a lot of these different directions.
Now, in terms of back to humans, I know that you have a background in physical therapy. Have you have cases of people who have been inactive and developed this muscle atrophy? How do you tackle that with physical therapy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's a whole other area. So I'm as close as I can be to physical therapy without being a physical therapist myself. So I need to say that I'm not a physical therapist myself, but I collaborate with a lot of physical therapists.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband is a physical therapist, so I'm married for him. So, but and I have a son who's a physical therapist, so it kind of runs in the family. But so yes, I am in the Department of Physical Therapy, and I collaborate with physical therapists. And currently, I have a very productive collaboration with Dr. Kirby Mayer, who's a physical therapist, and he is a physical therapist who is specialized in the ICU, intensive care unit. And if you think about an intensive care unit, that's probably the most inactive anybody can be, right? If you are forced to be on bed rest because you have a respiratory issue, a cardiac issue, machines need to keep you alive, you're physically inactive. And so we currently have a grant in which we look at the people who come out of an ICU to see how they recover and how that recovery happens. And so we do not have any interventions yet. So we do not yet know how to help them. We know that exercise is it's never a bad thing to do, but it doesn't always work. And it doesn't always work in elderly who come out of the ICU. And so to figure out what we can do is we are looking at if there are differences in the recovery from these patients and what correlates with those recoveries so that we can maybe more personalize their rehabilitation. Some people may need resistance exercise. Some people may need a nutritional intervention. Right. So we don't know that yet because we don't know enough about how they recover and how individuals recover. So that's one of the things we are looking at right now. There is, you mentioned, which is interesting, that what in the rehabilitation field is called prehabilitation, which is if you make sure the muscle is bigger before a person goes into ICU, you usually don't know, right? Although for patients who have lung issues and are on a lung transplant list or a cardiac transplant list, those people get rehabilitation. So there are programs in which they make sure that they try to build as much muscle as they can because those patients are sick. So that when they go into the hospital, it's not nearly as big of an insult as when they would not have that muscle mass. But there is quite a bit of active research ongoing in that area also to try to, for example, patients who go in for a hip replacement. Can we make sure that before they go in, they at least build their muscle, make sure their nerves and their muscles function optimally so that they then can recover maybe better.
So people in the audience, young scientists, aspiring physicians, this is an area of research that's still wide open for new discoveries, you think?
I think so. I think in general, physical therapy and rehabilitation in a lot of fields, there's a lot of research that can still be done in that area. I think personalized medicine may be something we're going towards. And figuring out exactly if a person has had 1, 2, 3, 4 things happen to them, is it better to do this with them, a certain intervention, than if they had number 5, 6, 7, and 8 happen to them, then this intervention works better. And I think we don't know that yet.
Okay. Well, Melissa has some extra questions for you, so I'll let her continue our conversation.
Sounds good. Thanks
Thank you.
for the question.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just sitting here like a bobblehead nodding along because this is just, you've got such an interesting intersection between, animal biology, nutrition and fitness, rehab and physical therapy, public health. I mean, you've covered so many kind of key topics, and I think there's so much that's of interest. I feel like we could sit and have this conversation for hours and hours and hours. Especially as you start to look at, like you said, personalized medicine and, within certain demographics of people, if you're an exercising female at 30, what does that do for your body at 60? And if you wait until you're 50 to start exercising, what does that do? And so I think there's so much of interest here. And I think you've got a really cool intersection between all of those different topics that I think is really fascinating. And I think will hopefully inspire people to kind of follow along with your work a little bit more closely because you do have so
Yeah,
many topics
and I
of
do think
interest.
that you know, most of the credit is not due to me. It's due to the environment that I'm in. So being at the University of Kentucky, where we have trauma one centers, where we have large ICU, where we have a clinical center for translational medicine or translational science, where we have an NCI designated cancer center. But we also have engineering, and we have kinesiology, we have public health. Essentially, everything we need is on one campus at walking distance. And I think that does make a big difference on what you can do as a researcher. So it takes it. I think Melissa, this may have been, we may have said this before you started recording, but it takes a big team. And Wilson just contacted me because I'm part of that team. And I think every team member is equally important in a team like this. We have physicians who work very closely with us. We do muscle biopsies, which I cannot do. Maybe I could do them, but I'm not allowed to do them. But we have physical therapists, we have study coordinators. So it takes a lot of different people to do all of this work, and it takes a special place to do it. And I think University of Kentucky is a very special place.
It sounds like an excellent hub for collaboration. And that was one of the themes that we had talked about in your work is, how you're collaborating with a team in Alaska. And the paper drew, our attention because you're in Kentucky. And as the Kentucky Academy of Science, we're trying to highlight that Kentucky work. But I think what folks maybe who are outside of the sciences don't always understand is that science is such an interconnected field where you're working with, animal biologists in Alaska while you're at the University of Kentucky also collaborating with physical therapists and physicians in the ICU. And I think it's a really intricate relationship, and it's a really intricate web that brings us to the scientific discoveries that we see. It's not just a linear thing like it's often so, minimized and portrayed in the public, that it is really intricate, and it does take, like you said, a fantastic team of people to get to the point where you can share the work and have results to share. Switching gears just a little bit, we kind of wrap up with this question for each of our visitors. Can you tell us about a time that you faced adversity, or that either the science didn't go well or something in your career didn't go well, and how you pushed through that and how that may have shaped you as a researcher and as a scientist?
We're in the middle of a crisis. And that is not an understatement. I think right now, the biggest adversity I've ever faced is right now. And that's not just because of a lack of funding. That is because, yes, funding will be decreasing, but also the support of the public in science. And that scares me more. The fact that we are kind of losing the confidence of the people for whom we are doing this in science. So I cannot tell you how we're going to get out of this. So I don't know how to get on the other side of it. what we are doing is continuing to do what we think is right, which is doing the research we do in a very rigorous manner. So we still do, we treat our patients ethically like we've always done. We treat our animals ethically like we've always done. We keep on doing and working hard at what we do because we believe in what we do. Um, and I think there's been difficult times before. I've been asked by students and postdocs right now, it's like, how do we get through this? What did you do? Have you ever had anything like this before? And I can tell them honestly, no, I've never gone through anything like this before. We have gone through hard patches with funding. And so you try to find different funding sources, for example. Um, I think it takes a lot of dedication. So I think to get into this, you have to be very dedicated to science and dedicated to finding solutions for difficult problems. It is super interesting. If you're somewhat of a science nerd, this is the way to go. Um, it is right now not easy, but I think keeping on doing, and I applaud you for doing what you do, because I do think that outreach to the public is one of the most important things we can do. I think the public needs to know that we do our research in a very rigorous, ethical manner, and that we only publish what we think has been conducted in a rigorous manner and ethically. And well, maybe 10 years from now, we can come back for this discussion and see how we get out of it. But yeah, I think that's all I can say about the adversity right now.
I think you said a really interesting statement in that the adversity isn't just the funding, but it's the losing trust of the people whom we do this for.
Mhm.
And that I think is huge because, you know, I'm in an education position, and I always say I don't get into education to make $1 million. Like it's just not going to happen. Most of the time, folks aren't getting into science to make money.
Nope.
You know, you're not living a fantastic, lavish, maybe you're living a fantastic life, but chances are you're not, living a very lavish lifestyle. You live a very simple life. You go to work, you do your experiments, you eat, sleep, and breathe that work. You're dedicated. It becomes part of the fibers of who you are and part of your identity. And so I think what, we need to keep in mind as we're educating the public, and as the public, I hope, is keeping an open mind to learning about the stories that we're sharing, um, is that, there is a motivation, there's a human motivation for this. We want to understand work like yours where it could have implications for public health in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, several years down the road. It could be me laying in a hospital someday, and your work could revolutionize how I recover. And so when we kind of think about that, it's easy for us as scientists to understand that journey that takes to get to a result where it's tangible and we understand it. That's the pipe dream for a scientist, is my work makes a difference. But I think what we need to try and help the public do, and you kind of hit it with that statement, the people whom we do this for, is helping them see that we don't get to that innovation, we don't get to that change of, care principles or how we do things. You don't get to that personalized medicine without years and years of research and data and work and funding and all of those important pieces that tie in, that make, the daily science, that everyday grind, that, you go to the lab and you're running experiments over and over and over again, and then analyzing data and all of those key pieces. We don't get to that end result, that neat, tidy bow, without all of that work
Correct.
for years and years and years.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of a really important piece for, our listeners who maybe aren't connected to the sciences, or maybe who are, even if that's somebody who's, struggling right now with, hey, this is really hard, this is really heavy. why am I still going? You find that why, and that you remember that why. And that's, what we're doing this for. And it may be a pipe dream. We may never see that in our lifetime, but knowing that what you're doing now will impact folks in the future, I think is really powerful. Kind of along those lines. So what's next for you in terms of research, if you can tell us, what you're working on and what you're looking forward to?
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of things. I'm really, like I said, we always have in our mind we want to do this for a human application. So I'm really happy to be able to collaborate with the people that are in the physical therapy field to work on the ICU recovery, particularly with aging. So we continue to do that work and look for potential interventions that we can start using. I'm, on the other hand, also really interested in the very molecular part of muscle. And that is the more kind of scientist in me that or the basic scientist in me. So I'm also very interested in how come that process of protein synthesis, that particular process, what molecules are involved in that, and why is that different with aging? And so we just submitted a grant where we looked at some of those things. It's like this tiny little area actually of protein synthesis, which is super important later on, right? The making of protein is really important, but those couple of molecules that are involved is a very detailed process that I'm right now also very interested in. So I'm kind of working on both ends and trying to combine them, because we can all, of course, whatever we find in the lab at that level, we can look, because we do take muscle biopsies from patients who are willing to give a biopsy, and we can look at those particular molecules in those patients. So we can bridge that, and that's what I'm really looking forward to doing in the next 5 or so years, and then we'll see after that. But really to see if what we find, maybe in an animal model, but also tissue culture, but in an animal model, if that is the same as in a human, and if we can then say, okay, then if this works in an animal, then this may work in a human, and so. That's really what is next for me.
Awesome. So I want to ask, because what we do a lot is promote things on social media, and we direct folks to our website as sources of information. Is your lab group on social media, or do you have a website where we can kind of follow along with your progress?
Oh, that's a good question. So the Center for Muscle Biology does have a Twitter account, but I'm not sure if it's very active anymore.
Okay.
A lot of scientists have moved away from Twitter. We have not set up a Blue Sky account yet. That's actually something we should do. I do not have a website. I don't think my collaborator has a website either. That's actually something we should look into. Yeah, we need to do that.
It's hard to find the manpower to
so
do it
busy.
all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then the Center for Muscle Biology really doesn't have a big budget, and so we cannot hire anybody to do that.
Gotcha. Sounds like a mission for continued work for the Kentucky Academy of Sciences to follow up and check in and see, how things are continuing, and how we can continue to hopefully share your story and share this important work.
Yeah. So one thing I was thinking about, so do you ever go to, for example, the Kentucky American Physiological Society or something? Because those meetings are either usually in Lexington or in Louisville. They have, I think one has been maybe even in Moorhead one time. I'm not sure, but that might be something to look at in the future also.
So the Kentucky Academy of Science actually has an annual meeting. And so that's one place where we encourage folks who are doing research in the state of Kentucky. This year, it'll be November 21st and 22nd at the University of Louisville, and it moves around every year. And because we are, an academy or a society of 5,000 members, we've got folks in mathematics, we've got physiology, we've got, chemistry and biology. We've got tons um, of different disciplines, but we're always, always, always looking to encourage folks to, submit their abstract, submit their proposal, and come to that meeting to share their science with other scientists in Kentucky, to draw attention to what they're doing, draw our attention to what they're doing. With 5,000 members, sometimes it's hard for us to, keep tabs on every single little one, but it is certainly,
Okay.
something that
Yeah.
we want to encourage people to come and present their research and, make those connections across the state and have, a collaboration of scientists and educators in the state of Kentucky who together help elevate all of science and all of the research that's being done, across the state. There is some strength in numbers, I think, especially in these challenging times. And so hopefully what we can do is continue to encourage people and bring people together and share the fantastic work that is being done. So I want to say thank you for joining us today and for your willingness to, walk us through the research that you're doing and your, communication with us throughout this process. We're really grateful that you were here to share your story today.